And I'm sure that you've probably seen in the book, there's a lot of detail in this section, right? And there's a lot of different things. We'll just focus on what I'm talking about in lecture, and I'll try and point out things that you can sort of skip over within the book, particularly sort of the beginning parts of the chapters. Oh, that's weird. Like it says here, right? We're going to start talking about the brainstem, right? And in some ways, it's the most important part of your brain, right? So your forebrain, or sort of the frontal lobe, does all of your cognitive thinking and what I think makes you human, right? But in reality, your brainstem is sort of the more important part, right? It's sort of the more vestigial part. It's sort of in all vertebrates have a brainstem, right? And there's some fish that we call swimming brainstems because they don't have a forebrain. But like it says up here, right? You can vegetate without your cortex, right? You can not have your cortex and you can be in sort of a vegetative state, and you can still survive, right? Although you don't thrive, you survive. But you can't live without your brainstem, right? So everything that you need to live and actually control your internal part of your body, that is coming from your actual brainstem, right? Sort of some of the nuclei that we're going to talk about today. Okay, so it contains all the ascending and descending connections of the cortex and the spinal cord. We've seen that a lot here, right? Particularly with the motor system and the sensory systems. All of those motor systems go through the brainstem in some way, right? Everything coming up, right? All the sensory systems also have to go through the brainstem. So it's also a conduit, right? So there's going to be, when we talk about internal structures later on, we'll talk a lot about sort of these pathways that we've been seeing. So there's pathways within there that acts as a conduit, but there also is going to be the nuclei, or the actual cell bodies of neurons that we're going to talk about today. Right? And so this is a little bit pedantic, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on here. It contains all the what we call true cranial nuclei. So cranial nerve is actually a nerve that goes sort of to your brainstem, and we're going to include two others sort of in this list. So the first and second cranial nerves are, I guess, what we call true cranial nerve nuclei, but all of the rest of them, 3 through 12, are true cranial nerves, and the nuclei for them are in the brainstem, right? But that's not really that too clear. This isn't really that important.
We don't need to know that 1 through.
Yeah. I'm not going to quiz you on that yet. No. And then something that we're not going to talk about today, what we're going to talk about with the internal structure, it contains something called the reticular formation. Basically, all of the neurons necessary for internal regulation and regulation of sort of consciousness, basically allowing information to get up to your forebrain, that's all going to be in the brainstem as well, right? And we're going to talk a lot more about this when we talk about the internal structures of the brainstem later on. Okay, this is just here because your book talks about different fossae within the skull. And so you can kind of follow along, I think, a little bit easier. So your skull has 3 different fossae. There's a middle fossa, which is sort of this middle region with the temporal lobes. This is all the posterior fossa that this chapter, I think, talks about several times. And then there's an anterior fossa up here, right? It's essentially, if you took the skull, you take the top part of it off, and you're looking down without the brain, right? There's 3 sorts of divots here, right? There's this divot that's right here. It says posterior fossa. That's where the brainstem is going to be, right? It's where the pons and medulla essentially are going to be here. The anterior fossa, right? That's where sort of the frontal lobe essentially is going to be. And then this middle fossa here, right? That's where the temporal lobes kind of sit down into this area here, right? So as you're reading it, it'll talk about the posterior fossa a lot, like where things are covering. That's this blue area right here. Yeah.
For the sake of this upcoming quiz, do we really just want to focus on the posterior fossa, or?
Yeah,
or
this is just so you know,
okay,
like what the book is talking about,
okay,
right? And then your book in the beginning talks a lot about all of the different ways that the cranial nerves actually get out of the skull, right? All of these different foramen that it sort of labels through the different things. We're going to ignore all of that in here, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the pathways of the cranial nerves. I'm more interested in the fact that you know where they are in the brainstem and then what they do functionally, right? as we go through. So you can ignore the entire section on all of the different foramen within the skull and how the cranial nerves go through there. Right. This image is pretty good though to sort of start talking about the cranial nerves because we can see all of them here. So they're numbered essentially from anterior to posterior here and kind of superior to inferior within the brain, right? So they kind of come in order here. So if we just start with the very first one, right? So this is the very first one right here, the olfactory cranial nerve, and this is actually what you see here though is not the actual olfactory nerve. I'll talk about this in a moment right here. Okay, so this sort of bigger structure here, this is the olfactory bulb, and then this is the olfactory nerve, but it's not actually the cranial nerve that we're talking about here. Okay, so that does all of olfaction, right? Smell in particular, right? And so I don't have a good image of this. I'll just draw this out real quick for you. So if we take this and I cut it down here, and we're going to look at it from lateral, right? So we're going to look at it lateral. So I'll sort of put the anterior part here and the posterior part over here. Okay? So it would look kind of like this. Right? So this is the bulb here, which is this right here, and then this is the olfactory sort of tract back here. Okay? So this is the bulb, and this is the tract back here. Okay? So this is lying on bone here that you can see right here. Okay? So this lies on the skull bone, sort of sits here. Right? And then if we sort of add in the nose, that would kind of come down this way. This would be sort of like your nostril here. And then this whole area right here is your sinus, sort of inside this part, right? So air is going to come in through here and go this way. So it's sort of empty space right here, right? So like I said, this is the olfactory bulb, this is the olfactory tract. You actually have neurons that go through the skull right here, down into this area, and they're going to detect odors, right? These are actually your olfactory cranial nerve. So this right here is the actual cranial nerve, and then this is what people sort of point to a lot when they talk about this olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract, right? But that's actually sort of the second part of this, because it's going to synapse in here, and there's going to be new neurons that are going to go this way. So these neurons are technically your first cranial nerve that sort of sit and that go through the actual skull here, and that detect the odorants that are in this sinus cavity down here.
So the cell bodies of the ones we're talking about, the actual cranial nerves, are sitting where? Are those the synapses?
Yeah. So it doesn't really matter. The cell body is actually...
The cell body's in the olfactory bulb.
Yeah. So there's a cell body here, and there's also a synapse that occurs here
Okay,
as well.
sure.
Yeah. All right, does that make sense? Everybody? Okay. So that's probably one of the simpler cranial nerves, right? All it does is it's olfactory, right? Smells, and that's all we're doing here, right? So then the second one that we can see on here, right? This is the optic nerve. So this nerve is for sight, right? Optic being visual, right? And so all of your visual information is going to come through this nerve. Its cell bodies are actually within your eye, within the actual retina, right? And then those axons that are going to go out of the retina, they're going to come back here. We're going to see them later on, actually, as they go into the brainstem here. Okay, but those are the two what I was just talking about, right? Like non-conventional cranial nerves, because they're cell bodies, and most of them are sort of outside of the brainstem. Okay. So that information is going to come back, right? Obviously, it's going to end up in the occipital lobe that we talked about before. We'll also see how it gets there as well. All right. The next one is the oculomotor nerve. That's this sort of small one right here. It's also fairly simple in the fact that its name is what it is, oculomotor. It drives the eye muscles, right? The motor neurons for the eye or the eye muscle. That's right. It doesn't do all of them, and we're going to talk a lot more about vision and eye muscles when we get to the eye lecture. So we're going to kind of skip a lot of that as we go through here. Okay. All right. Where's trochlear? Is it on here?
Yeah, it's below motor root, if you see motor root.
Right in the middle.
Right in the middle, yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. So trochlear is also a ocular motor nerve. It goes to the muscle that goes through a piece of tissue called the trochlear, and that's just also necessary for eye movement. And then we get to the trigeminal nerve here. Okay, so the trigeminal nerve is actually the 5th cranial nerve, although it says tri in the name. The reason it comes from that is because there's 3 main divisions of it. So the trigeminal nerve has 3 main divisions to it. So it's V1, V2, and V3 are those 3 divisions of that. And this is mostly sensory, although we'll talk a little bit about its motor function as well, right? So this is a mixed cranial nerve that has motor and sensory, but the bulk of the trigeminal nerve, or at least most of the thickness of this nerve, comes from the sensory portion of it. Okay.
Sorry, and you said the trochlear nerve was for optic, or for
Eye movement.
eye movement? Okay.
Yeah.
And then the oculomotor is different than the optic. Which one is,
So-
you didn't talk about the optic.
So optic nerve, so that's information coming back, that's sensory, that's visual information.
Okay.
Oculomotor is going out to the eye muscles.
Okay, got it.
So you actually have 3, we'll talk about them here.
Okay.
So oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens. All 3 of those all go to eye muscles.
Okay.
All right. But we'll have an entire lecture on just those three nerves. So then we have trigeminal, right? Most of it is mostly sensory. And then you can also see there's this little, what this is, motor root of 5, or motor root of trigeminal, right? It's a small sort of motor portion of the trigeminal nerve there. All right. So then 6 is also an eye muscle nerve, the abducens nerve, and we'll talk about that in the eye lecture. Facial nerve, most of this nerve, or at least the majority of the axons within that nerve, are going to be what it's named for, right? The facial motor sort of aspect of it, right? All of your facial muscles are taken care of by the facial nerve here. There's going to be some sensory to it as well that we'll talk a little bit about, but that's the majority of the facial nerve here. Vestibulocochlear nerve, that one's pretty easy, right? So this is all sensory information coming from the ear. So either vestibular sense from the ear or auditory sense, right? Cochlear sort of portion of this, right, as it's coming in. Okay, and then the rest of them, 9, 10, 11, 12, are all mixed nerves, and they do a lot of different things, and they do sort of a lot of parasympathetics that we'll talk about, and also sort of random or seemingly random muscles that are necessary for sort of swallowing or in your sort of neck area. The rest of them, they're not as sort of clear cut and defined as these ones are here. And we'll talk about those more, I think, on Tuesday.
Did you cover, I'm sorry, did you cover the ophthalmic nerve? I'm just trying to keep up with you.
Yeah. So the trigeminal nerve here, I didn't talk about the 3 individual parts of it.
Okay, but those are part of the trigeminal.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that's why they have this V, meaning 5 after them, right?
Okay.
So the ophthalmic, maxillary mandibular nerve, right? Those are all part of the trigeminal
Okay,
nerve. So
so
that's the 3 portions
So
of
the
it.
motor root of actually includes those 3, like when it says that.
So this
5.
is these are all sensory,
Okay.
and then this is sort of a motor portion of
Okay,
the
got
trigeminal nerve. Yeah, but we'll go through each of these nerves. Well, I guess we'll start with 5 here, right, today, and we'll sort of talk about the exact specifics
gotcha.
of them. Yeah. All right. This is just here, just a brief. Remember that we have this sort of tentorium cerebelli here. So the cerebellum is sitting down here, and again, this is the posterior fossa is back here. It's underneath of this tentorium cerebelli here, and this is where most of those cranial nerves are actually going to be coming out this direction, right? We can see that here as well, right? So it's backwards. So that tentorium cerebelli is going to come right through here and sit and almost divide essentially the midbrain from the pons here as well, right? So this is the general area that we're talking about today, right? We have the midbrain area that's right here. The ending of it, right, is right here where the pons actually begins, where we have this sort of anterior bulge here, indicating that we're in the sort of pons region here, right? That tentorium cerebelli is going to sit right here, and the cerebellum essentially is going to stick onto the back of this right here, right? So this area right in here, right, this is that fourth ventricle that I've been talking about here. And we're going to talk about this sort of area right in here quite a bit as we move forward. So this is that fourth ventricle right on the posterior aspect of that fourth ventricle. That's where the cerebellum is going to sit here, and anterior to that is going to be the pons region, right? And then down here, after the pons kind of comes in, this will be the medulla, right? So we have medulla, pons, midbrain, right? And then we'll see all of the cranial nerves sort of in this region right here as they're coming out.
And the tentorium cerebellum goes between the midbrain and the pons, and then over the top of the cerebellum?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so we're gonna look at this. So so we have midbrain essentially right here, right? Here is the pons region here, and the medulla is down in this area, right? And then we go down into the spinal cord down here. Okay. So if we start at the top, so here's midbrain. Up above that, right? That's the thalamus, right? So we kind of briefly talk about the pulvinar of the thalamus, right, or the posterior part. This is the thalamus right here. It's sitting on top of the midbrain as we're coming down. Okay. So along the midline here, we're gonna have a bunch of different structures on this posterior part. So this essentially is where the cerebellum would sit here, and we've removed the cerebellum, and now we're looking at the rest of it from posterior, right? So if we go back, we are looking from this way, but we've removed this entire cerebellum as we're looking down on here.
And sorry, the midbrain starts, the thalamus
It's
goes
on
right
top
on
of
top of like the pineal
midbrain.
body and the
Yep.
optic tract. So from basically the pineal body and then down to like the trochlear nerve, is that kind
Yes.
of the section?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep,
those are all
absolutely.
considered midbrain.
Midbrain, yep.
Okay.
Yep. So yeah, so as we're going down here, right, you can see this structure right here, right on the midline, right? It doesn't have a left and a right. It's just one sort of on the midline here, the pineal body. We're not going to talk about it too much in this class, other than it's a nice landmark. It's easy to see on here.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually not. It's not nervous. It's an endocrine gland, right? So this is actually where melatonin is going to be produced from your pineal body, right here. Okay. So that's what that's doing here. Okay. So just underneath the pineal body, we have these four sort of bulges here that are going to have a left and a right to them. So we have the superior colliculi and then also the inferior colliculi down here. And these are going to be essentially major relay stations for the vestibular cochlear nerve. And we'll talk more about the vestibular cochlear nerve in a bit here, but actually I think next time or even the class after that. The inferior colliculi, this is where auditory information is going to come in synapse. And the superior colliculi, that's where vestibular information is going to come in synapse there. Okay. So we're going to talk a lot about the superior colliculi when we talk the entire lecture on eye movement, or the eye lecture is going to involve a lot of the superior colliculi, because there's a lot of interconnection between these nuclei and all of the cranial nerves I was talking about that move the eye, and the vestibular input and an eye output here, right? So they have this sort of a major relay station here. Inferior colliculi is a little bit easier. Auditory information is going to come through there. I'll talk about that in a minute here. And then over here, right, we have these two structures that we saw when we talked about the thalamus before, right? So we have this lateral geniculate body and a medial geniculate body, right? They're both going to be lateral to this superior colliculi here, right? So colliculi, right, is, to go back a little bit, is plural. Colliculus is the singular if you're just talking about one. But the lateral geniculate body, you can see here, comes from the optic tract, right? So it's going to be one of the first major areas that optic or visual information comes in synapses, right? So this optic tract is coming from the eyes, right? It's going to come back and it's going to come into here, and it's actually going to synapse here in this what we call LGN, right, or lateral geniculate nucleus or lateral geniculate body. Right? right, sort of on the outside here. So this is all visual information.
Sorry, those are, so that in the optic tract or in the medial geniculate body, it's where, or say lateral, is where they synapse.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
in the lateral. They
Yeah.
the axons go through optic and then they synapse in the lateral.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a little I guess I've been using the words together, right? So when you look at it from the outside, there is a bulge here. We call that the lateral geniculate body, right? If we take a cross section and we're looking at this structure like when we looked at it with the thalamus, we call it the lateral geniculate nucleus, right? It's the same thing. It's a nuclei, it's a bunch of cell bodies, there's a bunch of synapses within there, right? It's just when you look at it from the outside, it's a body, and when you're talking about the synapses within there, or if you're looking at the inside, we call it a nucleus. Right? So the nucleus essentially makes this bulge here, that's the lateral geniculate body. Okay? That's object information coming this way.